Welcome to this explainer. Today, we are going to tell exactly what happened that time the Catholic Church did something so unimaginably dark, it literally sounds like the plot of a gothic true crime thriller. We're going to tell the whole story. We are traveling back to the late 9th century to unpack a moment of pure, unadulterated historical madness, a moment where a deceased pope was actually dug up from his grave, dressed in sacred vestments, and put on trial. This incredibly bizarre event is known as the Cadaver Synod.
Okay, let's dive right into this, because to really grasp the sheer shock this caused, even back in the brutal medieval world, you have to hear this 9th century quote from the Annalae Alemannicae. It places us right inside the dim, cavernous walls of the Lateran Basilica in Rome. Picture this. It's January in the year 897 AD. The person sitting on the papal throne isn't a living, breathing man. It is a 9-month-old decomposing corpse. The overwhelming smell of decay is just filling these sacred halls, and yet the surrounding clergy are sitting there, forced to treat this macabre, horrifying display as a completely legitimate court of law.
So, you really have to ask yourself, how did the papacy, which was the absolute highest and most sacred office in the Western world at the time, devolve into a literal macabre puppet show? Well, to understand this, we have to look a bit beyond the bizarre spectacle itself. This wasn't just some spontaneous act of madness by a deranged leader. Not at all. This was actually the violent climax of chaotic political survival, brutal factionalism, and a really desperate struggle for power in a world where all the standard rules were rapidly disintegrating.
To set the stage for exactly what happened, we need to look at the late 9th century, which historians often call the Iron Age of the papacy. The great Carolingian Empire, the mighty empire of Charlemagne, was completely crumbling. Europe was fracturing left and right, and without a strong emperor to maintain order, a ruthless power vacuum just ripped open in Rome. And notice how incredibly fast things moved during this era. Pope Formosus dies in April of 896. His successor, Boniface VI, lasts barely 2 weeks before dying, likely of gout. Then, Stephen VI takes the throne. And in less than a year, Stephen has ordered his predecessor dug out of the earth for a trial.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how that ruthless power vacuum fueled a bitter, intensely violent political rivalry. Rome was completely torn between two warring aristocratic factions. On one side, you had Pope Formosus. He was absolutely terrified of the aggressive local Spalatin faction. So to protect the papacy, Formosus invited an outsider, King Arnulf of Carinthia, to invade Italy, and he crowned him Holy Roman Emperor. But on the other side, you had the Spalatins, led by Lambert and his fiercely ambitious mother, Egiltrude. When Formosus died and Arnulf suffered a stroke and retreated, the Spalatin faction came roaring back into Rome, backing the brand-new pope, Stephen VI, and they wanted revenge. That desperate, burning desire for revenge is exactly what brings us to January 897. Stephen VI orders Formosus' corpse exhumed from St. Peter's Basilica, and it's just this incredibly cinematic, horrifying scene. The body is hauled into the Lateran Basilica, dressed up in full, glorious papal vestments, and literally propped up in a chair. And because this is, remarkably, an official legal proceeding, the dead man needs a defense attorney. So they actually assigned a terrified teenage deacon to stand behind the rotting corpse and speak on behalf of Formosus.
The wildest part is that we actually have historical records of what was shouted in that room. The 10th century historian Luitprand of Cremona recorded Stephen VI screaming this exact quote right at the corpse. "When you were Bishop of Porto, why did you usurp the universal Roman see in such a spirit of ambition?" I mean, just imagine the absolute fanaticism going on here. You have Stephen VI pacing the floor, hurling insults and screaming tirades at a silent, putrescent body, all while a trembling teenager stammers out weak defenses for a dead man.
So, what were the actual legal charges you could possibly bring against a corpse? Surprisingly, they were highly specific and bizarrely technical canonical charges. First up was perjury. They claimed Formosus broke an old oath to remain in exile. Second was transmigration of sees. Back then, bishops were essentially married to their local church, and they really weren't supposed to move around. Well, Formosus had left his bishopric in Porto to become the pope in Rome. And finally, the third charge was illicit exercise of the episcopate, which basically argued that because he broke the rules in the first place, absolutely everything he did as a bishop or a pope was entirely illegal.
And this brilliantly illustrates the massive, towering hypocrisy of this entire trial. Pope Stephen VI was guilty of the exact same crime. Yes, Formosus transmigrated from Porto to Rome, but Stephen VI had done the exact same thing. He had moved from being the Bishop of Anagni to becoming Pope in Rome. And it gets crazier, because Formosus was actually the one who had ordained Stephen as a bishop in the first place. So Stephen was using this horrifying trial as a massive legal loophole. If Formosus's papacy was entirely invalidated, then Formosus's act of making Stephen a bishop never legally happened. This meant Stephen wasn't technically a bishop when he became pope, which conveniently cleared him of the very crime he was prosecuting.
But the universe, it seems, has quite a sense of dramatic timing. Right in the middle of this grotesque trial, an actual, violent earthquake struck Rome. It literally shook the Lateran Basilica to its core, damaging the structure. Now, to the frightened, coerced clergy sitting in that room, this terrifying rumble was an undeniable omen of divine anger. God was furious. And yet, Pope Stephen VI completely ignored the shaking walls and just pressed forward to secure his predetermined guilty verdict.
Unsurprisingly, Formosus was found guilty. But you see, this trial was about so much more than just a verdict. It was a highly calculated act of damnatio memoriae, a deliberate, focused attempt to entirely erase him from history. Formosus still had allies in Rome, and some even considered him a holy man. By completely desecrating his body, Stephen aimed to destroy any chance of Formosus's followers venerating him as a saint or a martyr, wiping out his legacy and his political faction in one brutal stroke.
The sentence handed down after the guilty verdict was brutal, it was methodical, and it was explicitly designed to strip Formosus of all human dignity. Let's walk through exactly how this desecration went down. First, Stephen ordered the corpse stripped of all its glorious papal vestments. Second, and definitely the most gruesome part, he had the 3 fingers of Formosus's right hand hacked off. These were the specific fingers used to give papal blessings. Third, they dressed the battered body in the cheap, coarse clothes of a layman. And finally, after briefly burying it in a pauper's grave, they dug it right back up, tied weights to it, and threw the corpse into the Tiber River, which was the traditional Roman dumping ground for the absolute worst criminals.
But Stephen's grand plan backfired catastrophically. The public wasn't intimidated, they were horrified. This extreme sacrilege crossed a line that deeply, deeply offended the people of Rome. Soon after, the waterlogged body of Formosus washed ashore and was rescued by a monk. Almost immediately, rumors began to spread like wildfire that the rotting corpse was actually performing miracles on the riverbank. And that was the spark the city needed. The public rose up in a violent, furious mob against Stephen VI.
Let's just trace how incredibly fast the pendulum of power swung right after this. By August 897, which is just months after the trial, Stephen VI was deposed by the mob, stripped of his papal robes, thrown into prison, and strangled to death. By December, a new pope, Theodore II, annulled the Cadaver Synod entirely. By 898, Pope John IX formally and respectfully reburied Formosus in St. Peter's Basilica and ordered all the records of the ghastly trial burned. But incredibly, the chaos still didn't end there. A few years later, in 904, a pro-Spalatin pope named Strangest III took power and actually reinstated the guilty verdict against the corpse all over again, before it was eventually ignored by history for good.
So the crucial point we need to take away from all this madness comes down to one mind-boggling number: 17. There were 17 different popes in the 9th century alone. Between 896 and 904, they averaged a brand new pope every single year. The Cadaver Synod wasn't just a random act by a madman. It was the ultimate grotesque symptom of a deeply broken, corrupt, and faction-ruled system, where survival meant utterly destroying your predecessor by literally any means necessary.
Which leaves us with this final, provocative thought. How far will political factions go to weaponize the justice system and rewrite history? The Cadaver Synod might seem like an insane, distant medieval nightmare, but at its very core, it is a story about canceling a predecessor's legacy to legitimize your own power. It really forces us to reflect on how this 9th century horror story mirrors the timeless human obsession with controlling the past. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning the past, and I'll see you next time.